Of the worst. When we come to Genesis 37, we come to an important transition in the book of Genesis, where the promise given to Abraham and Isaac is fulfilled through the family of Jacob. What's so interesting about this story is that the narrator chooses to unfold the story through Jacob's second youngest son, a 17-year-old lad. And it raises the question, why did he choose to tell the story through Joseph? I think one reason is to encourage us and to let us know that whoever we might be, wherever we might be in our walk of life, however young or old we are, God will use us as long as we make ourselves available to Him. But before we begin to delve into today's story, let's review very briefly the background to the story. You may recall that Joseph was the second youngest of the 12 sons. He was merely a servant to his older brothers. He had given a negative report to his father about older brothers, which implied that a rift had occurred between Joseph and his brothers. And we know and we learn from the reading of the story that Joseph's brothers hated him because he was Jacob's favorite, symbolized by the multicolored tunic that his father had given him. As the story continues, when Joseph shared his dreams with his brother and father, they became outraged with what Joseph's dream symbolized, that he would become their superiors. Everything seemed to be working against Joseph. To make matters worse, Joseph's brothers decided to kill him. That was the easiest way to deal with the problem. But Reuben convinced them not to do so. They decided to leave him in a pit. To cover their tracks, they lied to Jacob, telling him that Joseph had been killed by a wild beast. It unfolds like a soap opera. I know that Filipinos have a number of famous soap operas, and this reads like a modern-day novel. But what's interesting about the story, even in today's episode, we never discover what Joseph was thinking or saying. We find no comments in the story. And also, seemingly, the lack of divine intervention that was so prominent in the life of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So what's so special about this young lad, Joseph? I believe, as today's story illustrates, that he had an uncanny ability to make the best out of the worst. And the question arises, how was he able to do that? Recall that Jacob's father had wrestled with God's messenger until daybreak. That was his decision. He decided to wrestle with God's messenger. Secondly, Jacob required the messenger to bless him before he let him go. His second decision. And how did God's messenger, reply to Jacob? You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and humans and have prevailed. After the man blessed him, Jacob said, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. So the reason I think the story is told through Joseph is because of the fact that Joseph followed the example of his father Jacob. He was willing to strive and wrestle with God and the most difficult challenges that faced him. Joseph, in fact, discovered that his greatest rewards came through his most difficult circumstances. And unlike his brothers, he chose not to respond in anger and resentment. He learned how to make the worst the best. With this background in mind, let's turn and read the summary of today's passage. Pharaoh made Joseph the overseer of his household, and God blessed Pharaoh's household for Jacob's sake. When Pharaoh's wife falsely accused Joseph of adultery, Pharaoh imprisoned him. Yet God continued to show Joseph favor, and he became the warden of the prison. The life lesson that I want us to consider today is this: great rewards come from difficult circumstances as long as we believe and trust God, even when we don't feel like it. Like Joseph, we can make the best of the worst. The lesson is a reflection on God's caution to Cain, who became disappointed because his sacrifice was unacceptable. Caution given to Cain by God is worth remembering. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. From my prior message, we learned that we as humans are prone to feel hurt and angry. But we don't have to respond that way. We can always choose how to respond as we learn from today's story. If you're taking notes, the story is divided into 3 different sections. You might ask, why 3? You always seem to divide it into 3 sections. One thing that we learn in preaching is that our mind can only absorb a certain amount of material. So let's spend some time delving into the story. The story begins by introducing the scene in verses 1 through 6. Potiphar was Pharaoh's official. He had purchased Joseph as a slave, and throughout the story, the narrator emphasizes that God was always with Joseph in spite of what was happening. Consequently, even though a slave, he was successful in everything that he did in Pharaoh's house. Interestingly enough, though, the narrator of the story tells us nothing about Joseph's spirituality. He allows Joseph's actions to speak for themselves. I think it's fair to say that Joseph had a deep awareness of God's presence. Despite the difficulties, and the difficulties he had were many, God was always with him, and Joseph knew that. he was driven by the conviction that God was with him in spite of what was happening. Even at a young age, at age 17, God had endowed Joseph with the ability to have dreams and interpret them, in spite of the fact that his father and brothers did not understand. So the first lesson, and I've emphasized this before in other messages, first lesson of this story is to practice the presence of living in God's presence, especially when we're going through difficult circumstances. Why is this so important? Because our tendency is to isolate. When we run into difficulties, we might feel shameful, we might feel regretful, and we isolate ourselves from other people, and most importantly, from God. So when we notice God, his eyes turn upon us. And I think this is what pleases him like nothing else. But Joseph, notice, did not respond this way. He was a slave. He took his tasks very seriously. He completed his chores before God. So much so, he was so successful that Pharaoh made him the head of his household. Think of that for a moment. Joseph was the slave. And practically speaking, he became the CEO of Pharaoh's estate. It's quite a feat that Joseph accomplished. In short, Joseph was able to transform the worst to the best. He took the opportunity to be the best that he could be and do it for God's sake. A second lesson is the power of gratitude. From the beginning of the story, we find no trace of Joseph complaining. Think about it. He had a lot to be grateful for. Not being killed by his brothers, not dying thirst and anger in the pit, not being killed by a white beast or a wild beast. He was in probably the nicest home, nicest estate in Egypt, Pharaoh's house. Not only that, he was in charge of everything. So when we are faced with difficult situations, we can step back, get things into perspective by recognizing our current blessings to improve our perspective. Psychologists call this adaptive thinking. And this is something that we can learn with practice. It's not always easy to face difficult situations. It takes discipline, faith, courage, and endurance. Another takeaway from this part of the story is that our blessings can positively influence other people. You can actually become a conduit through which God's blessings flow to other people. You can become an influence. You ever watch the TED Talks or listen to the TED Talks on YouTube? Prominent people who are known as influencers and difference makers. If we depend on God, like Joseph did, we can become the same. As Genesis 38:5 states, from the time Pharaoh put Joseph in charge, God blessed Pharaoh for Joseph's sake. Pharaoh became so confident in Joseph that the only thing that he thought about was when to eat. He was very confident in Joseph. As we continue through the passage, we find in the second section Joseph's encounter with Pharaoh's wife. Joseph was a handsome young man. He caught the attention of Pharaoh's wife. And what did she do? She tried to seduce him. Lie with me. Come to bed with me, she exclaimed. She probably thought that Joseph would likely obey her temptation because he was nothing more than a slave. Even worse, she objectified Joseph as a means to fulfill and satisfy her own desires. Joseph could have complied. No small temptation indeed. In fact, possibly Joseph could have taken advantage of her and used the tryst for his own advantage. But Joseph would have none of that. He refused by saying, "Your husband has not kept anything from me except you as his wife. How then could I do such wickedness and sin against God?" On April 14th, 2026, a California woman alleged that Representative Eric Swalwell raped her in 2018. Two other women also alleged that they had encountered non-consensual sexual encounters with Representative Swalwell. Although he denied the charges, Representative Swalwell resigned from Congress and withdrew from the California governor's race. He was a political star rising to the top, and yet he flushed his own career down the toilet by his own actions. But not Joseph. Joseph did not succumb to the temptation of Potiphar's wife. He demonstrated integrity and remained loyal in his commitment to God and to Pharaoh and his master. Joseph had his spiritual house in order. He knew what was important. He made good choices. He demonstrated wisdom, and I think the God-given wisdom that he received as a very young man during his early teens. So, what's the takeaway here? God has implemented a moral compass within us. The ability to know right from wrong when our inner voice tells us when we're tempted, you better not do that. I remember growing up watching Flip Wilson series. He was a comedian. There was one episode where we had a little figure on his shoulder representing the devil. He would make jokes by saying, "The devil made me do it." Sometimes when we're tempted, we even get a queasy feeling in our stomach. Even our physical bodies become uncomfortable, signaling and cautioning us that we're moving in dangerous territory. But we do it anyway. We know the stove is hot, but we touch it anyway. Sometimes we fail to weigh the consequences of our own actions against ourselves, let alone how it impacts other people and our relationship with God. the Luciferian spirit. The devil tries to convince us that we can do anything we want to do with no consequences. We operate under the delusion that no one will find out, and yet history shows us that that's not true. It's only a delusion. So the bottom line is this: we should not play with sin. As God cautioned Cain before he murdered Abel, sin will come lurking at your door. If you let it in, it will overtake you. So we must master it. If not, it devours us. We can think of our life journey as a pathway that God has established for us. I've spoken of this as a common theme in the messages of Genesis. Despite Joseph's mishaps, despite the difficulties that he faced, God continued to bless him. Joseph found favor with God, and God favored him, and not only him, but those that surrounded him. When we drive down a road and ignore the warning signs, we put our life in jeopardy along with others. Same principle applies to our life journey. If we don't obey God's protective boundaries, if we don't pay attention to the rails that he has put up for us to help us find our way, we face danger and unexpected consequences. Joseph had grown up as a mature man, a thoughtful man with integrity. He had his spiritual house in order. He had his priorities in line. His commitment to God, his commitment to Pharaoh as his master, as a slave. And God continued to bless Joseph in everything that he did. Joseph made the worst the best. He had his own house in order, and he kept Pharaoh's in order also. But as the story continues, it even gets worse. The fate continues to fall upon Joseph. We come to the final section of the story, Pharaoh's wife's retaliation against Joseph. Pharaoh's wife continued to tempt Joseph, and yet he refused. Finally, she took his garment, and as he fled from the house, from Pharaoh's house, and she used it against Joseph to accuse him of infidelity. As far as I know, according to Egyptian law, infidelity was a very bad crime that even could put the accused to murder. The wife confronted Pharaoh, exclaiming her accusation against Joseph, and even implicitly blaming Pharaoh for what had happened. Remember her words. See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came to me to lie with me. Pharaoh became enraged and sent Joseph, his personal CEO, to prison. As Pharaoh taking Joseph to prison, I wonder what he was thinking. I imagine that the relationship that had evolved between Pharaoh and Joseph was like a son and a father. Perhaps he had regrets. Perhaps he could have had Joseph murdered. But he takes him to prison. And you would have thought by now that Joseph would have had enough. But Joseph hit another rock bottom. But notice how the story transitions in verse 21. There's a little conjunction there in the Hebrew called vav consecutive. Be translated in various ways, but when it's translated but, that means an important movement, an important transition is about to occur. Notice how the text reads, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer." Let's think for a moment about what happens in the story and what didn't happen. First, what did not happen? No fair hearing by Pharaoh. Joseph was not able to share his part of the story. No retaliation by Joseph toward God or anyone else. We have no hint that Joseph became angry. And interestingly enough, there's no divine intervention by God to protect Joseph's innocence. So what did happen? Joseph accepted the challenge of being treated unfairly and falsely accused. Because of that, because of Joseph's ability to withstand the situation, God continued to show favor for Joseph. God seems to like it when we depend on him. I think when we do that, he looks down and he smiles. Nothing could please him more. When we depend on God, I think he knows he can depend on us, like he did with Joseph. And notice how the story ends. The chief jailer liked Joseph so much. He was so impressed with Joseph, he must have seen something very admirable about Joseph. He made him the CEO or the chief warden. Phantom that. He had just been taken to prison, and now he's the chief warden of the prison. I imagine that he was not staying in the normal jail cell. He probably had the special quarters of the warden and probably was eating the best of meals. So Joseph became in charge, just like he was in Pharaoh's house. Let me conclude with a few final takeaways from this story. Life is not always fair. We could even say more cogently that life is not fair. If we accept this fact, we're in a much better position to cope with life's difficulties. We can learn to adapt as Joseph did, as long as we depend on God and as long as we can believe, even when we don't feel like it. And second, God has given us the gift of free will. It's a gift. When I refer to free will, we can ask ourselves a question: should I or should I not? God has also given us the ability to choose. How should I respond? No one can take the gift of free will and choice away from us in spite of what we go through or in spite of what we encounter. Viktor Frankl, in his classic book entitled Man's Search for Meaning, explains how he survived a German Nazi concentration camp. He focused on the freedom he had in thinking, realizing that no one could take that away from him, not even the Nazi Germans. He explains it this way: in spite of all the enforced physical and mental primitiveness of the life in a concentration camp, it was possible for spiritual life to deepen. No matter what we face, no matter what we go through, we can deepen our relationship to God and learn what it really means to depend on God for everything. And I would suggest the most important lesson that we learn from Joseph is this: it's not so much what we go through, bad as it may be. The crux of the matter is how we choose to respond. Despite what happened to Joseph, he was able to make the best of what happened. And Joseph's story confronts us with a very important question: how will I respond? It's possible, I believe, to make the worst the best when we depend upon God. Final point. We see in the story that Joseph was falsely accused when he was innocent. If you've been falsely accused and the truth never comes out, rest assured that it will in heaven. We're in transit here on earth. This is not our final destination. We have more to look forward to when we get to heaven. As Dr. Aaron Beck explains in his book entitled Prisoners of Hate, we are prone to feel angry and hurt by other people. We become overly involved in trying to figure out what people are thinking. We take their actions too personal, and we try to know and gauge what they think of us, which is impossibility. Dr. Beck says this is a poor investment of our time and energy. Like Joseph, we must learn to adapt and to relax and to enjoy the ebbs and flows of life, the ups and downs, realizing that God is always with us. And when we learn to depend on Him, He will show us favor. We must learn to depend on God as if our life depended on it. May God give us the courage, the strength, and faith to do our best to make the worst the best. Amen.